Hello, everyone. I'm Matan. Um, I'm a PhD student from the Development Planning Unit of University College London. I will present you about the Ma'abarot representations in Israeli discourse. So let's start. My lecture's outline going to be about the historical background, theoretical context, and case analysis. So about the introduction and the research questions. So the Israeli Ma'abarot, the Israeli Jewish people refugee transit camps, are one of the most ignored chapters in the political, historical, and cultural Israeli discourse. In 1952, there were 132 Ma'abarot in Israel, and 250,000 people live there. So, in fact, most of the Israeli Jewish immigrants who came to the young state of Israel that was established in 1948 had to pass through these transit camps. We will ask, my lecture will talk about two questions. One, why has this phenomenon been ignored in Israeli education textbooks, in the media, and in the historian work? And what are the discursive strategies that use to vanish the Ma'abarot? So a bit about the historical background that we have. So the main motive to the Ma'abarot was to house the mass Jewish immigration from Europe, from the Middle East and North Africa since 1948 and throughout the 50s. So the immigration started amidst the 1948 war, the Israel's independent war, that claimed the life of 1% of the Jewish population already living in mandatory Palestine. And the war resulted in the conquest of 78% of the mandatory Palestine, where before it was only 8.5% of the land that were owned by the Jewish population. And the mass immigration also changed the Israel's demography. So during Israel's first decade, 55 almost percent of the immigrants were from the Middle East. These Middle Eastern and North African Jews were called Mizrahi Jews. These are the Mizrahim. And also, there was already a Jewish population from Europe. This was called an Ashkenazi population from Europe and North America. And between May 48 till December 51, 680,000 people immigrated to Israel, Jewish people. And by the end of the decade, the population tripled itself. So it was a huge change in Israel's demography and land regime. What about the Ma'abara? What is a Ma'abara? Ma'abara is a term that Levi Eshkol, later on the prime minister, named these transit camps. He was then the head of the settlement department, the Jewish agency, and it comes from the Hebrew word transition that mentions that it should have been a temporary housing next to older cities. So the first one was built in May 50, and each family lived in 10 to 15 square meter shack or tent. So throughout the years, especially since 53, the government tried to, quote unquote, exterminate the Ma'abarot, and many of them become new towns and marginal neighborhoods in Israel socioeconomic periphery. This is what you see here in the picture. You see this celebration, as they mentioned, of the extermination of Holon Ma'abara, a town next to Tel Aviv. So some data about the interministerial committee data that these committee that was established by the Prime Minister Ben-Gurion. So from these data, we know that residents per shower, let's say cubicle, per shower cubicle was 15.9, per toilet for 14.9. So there was a terrible conditions there. In Kordani, being Ma'abara, there were 336 residents per one shower. There was almost 130,000 residents without street lighting, 100,000 without electricity. In Zichron Yaakov Ma'abara, 23 families per one tap shower. Really horrible conditions. And we see this letter to Morocco's ambassador in Jesse Cohen's Ma'abara, which was really, really interesting because it was in 79. And usually in Israel, people think about them about only the 50s, but now let's see that. So they write to him, dear Morocco ambassador in Paris, we are 120 Moroccan families, 600 people who arrived to Israel 10 or 20 years ago. We live in the most terrible conditions, regret that we decided to immigrate to Israel and leave our beautiful homeland Morocco. Because of the massive propaganda, the Israelis government propaganda. We live in a refugee camp. Nobody takes care of us because we are Moroccans and considered as African niggers, sorry for the word. We spoke to the Red Cross in order to leave Israel, but they didn't help. We address you and asking for visa to come back to Morocco as citizens. We prefer to end our lives in our homeland. So it wasn't only a problem in the 50s, we can see it as a continued condition even in 79. And to examine the Ma'abara discourse, I used the cultural approach to critical discourse analysis. Here in the picture, you could see from the Hulon Ma'abara in Jesse Cohen. And it was written there, this is a refugee camp. This is a camp of refugees, sorry. So we use three things, but let's say something about the cultural approach. It is a method that combines discourse analysis and cultural analysis. It is defined as a theoretical and practical tool exposing cultural meanings implied in the discourse and their contribution and reproduction of social dominance, military violence, and social inequality. So the main contribution here in this research is the application of this approach on a different case study that engages with inclusion processes and, as you could see, and us and them narratives, cultural narratives through the built environment and strengthening its spatial and post-colonial dimensions. So the first thing that we used was the cultural narrative, us and them, which is the way the other is constructed, identified, and marked negatively, while in contrast, the legitimate individual is seen obviously pure and shows the righteousness of the group's interests and aims. So instead of producing stories or testimonies, the culture prefers to recycle, as we could see the cultural narratives recycling issue, to recycle existing stories or thought of patterns. So the us was of the veterans became the Ashkenazi group, and the they of the immigrants became the Mizrahi population from Muslim countries. So the recycling narratives happens in the same text or others, or in visual and verbal text. We can see also the narrative reduction or silencing that focuses on reducing the narrative space and the complexity of the reality into a number of repeated plots. Similar to collective memory, this cultural narrative flattens the uniqueness of the personal stories and testimonies and makes them stereotypical. So now let's see one case analysis, an example of exclusion and euphemism in Davar Le'eladim, which is this newspaper, this magazine, children's magazine from the ruling party in Israel back then in the 50s. And we will see one of the examples over there, which is the Ma'abara poem that was published in this children magazine. So let's read it. The poem is named Ma'abara. And of course, a long time will not pass, and the children factory will be seen. Today around them will be wondering. Tomorrow will open their eyes. Neglected are their clothes, and their table is not rich. Tomorrow, and they will be like us. With us, they will be happy. Their beauty will come, and their body will be stronger. By work and game, they will become smarter. Learn and work. Then it will be said, they are native Israelis. By their walk in the meadow and furrow, who would know they are from Babylon? This is Iraq today, so it refers to Jewish people from Iraq that immigrated to Israel. Like us, like them in everything, and a refugee child from yesterday that came from a poor alley. Tomorrow they will be like you, like me, learn, work, dance, and the young citizen. So you could see definitely this us and them issue over here, the euphemism of this situation in the Ma'abara. Okay, so let's have a small summary here about these issues that we showed. So in conclusion, we've seen some of the discourses strategies that were used regarding this case study. So the first one was this euphemism and the exclusion by us and them cultural narrative. Also, I should mention that in Davar Le'eladim, you could see that a quantitative exclusion of the Ma'abarot. It wasn't, the entire magazine wasn't even mentioning the Ma'abarot, although so many people lived there in these times. This was a magazine that was published in 1951, so it was the most important era of the Ma'abarot, these refugee camps in Israel, this transit camp in Israel. And also you can see this naming of the Ma'abarot by Levi Eshkol. So the absence of the Israeli Ma'abarot, I should say, is a case study that demonstrates how a settler colonial society like Israel, like the Israeli society, handles historical scars from its past. This case study also is highly relevant to other ongoing researches now that examine immigration and post-colonial discourse all over the world. My lecture sheds light upon these current wounds in the Israeli society and explains this normalization discourse of what happened there and how by ignoring it, you make it something that seems to be normal, and how it evolves into new configurations in the present political culture. And this is what I would like to talk about now a bit, is this kind of, let's say, this settler colonial society and its land regime has great impact, not only on Mizrahi Jews, but also on Palestinians, of course, in the entire region. So let us ask ourselves to what extent, if any, this housing discourse contributed to the further evolution of conflict in the Middle East, and why this and how this conflict, this violent conflict, reproduces itself culturally within Israel through the Israeli government's discriminating treatment of Israeli Jews. Most of them became the Mabarot residents. So thank you so much for listening to me. I would be happy to answer your questions and see you all. Thank you.